So it looks like we're ready after a little bit of a delay. Can you guys hear me okay? Cool. All right. So I'm going to say good day because I don't know what time it is everywhere. And welcome to C4's Power Hour. C4 launched this Power Hour series in 2020 to support development of organizational capacity and leadership. And we particularly focused on peer recovery support organizations. This month's Power Hour is entitled Cultivating Next Generation Recovery Leaders and features two dynamic leaders in the arena, both from the new Arctic called Louisiana and Florida, respectively, Lacey DeSherry and Danielle Torino, and we'll have them introduce themselves a little later. I'm Larry Robertson, so I'm the moderator, and sort of like the pilots on the plane say, I will try to keep this, make up the time as we go along. And I always wondered how come you couldn't do that in the first place, but that's another story. Before we dive into our discussion, let me introduce C4 to those of you who are not familiar with us. So next slide, please. All right, so C4 is a consulting and training firm committed to advancing recovery, wellness, and housing stability, reducing disparities and achieving equitable outcomes, developing and implementing research-based solutions that are person-centered, recovery-oriented, and trauma-informed. And you can reach out to us through our website, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and we'll have a little bit more information about how to actually access some of the events toward the end of the session today. And so Vanessa, I'm going to turn the next couple of slides over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Larry. We just wanted to provide some tech tips to all of our attendees today. So we'll be using Zoom for today's training or event, and you can see here on the slide presented on your screen. If you do have any questions or any comments, you can press on the chat button and speaking of the chat, you can change it to all panelists and attendees. That way, everybody who is watching today's event, they can see your comments and your questions, and we can go from there. The audience is on listening mode only. So again, just please use the chat or raise your hand if you do have any questions. And we also have the Q&A box for any other questions that you may have. The event is being recorded and it will be available for viewing on our C4's YouTube channel at youtube.com. And if you would like any training or technical assistance, please email us at training@c4innovates.com. And with that, I'll pass it off again to Larry. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Vanessa. So our aim today is to explore kind of the many different ways that leadership displays itself and the particular ways in which we cultivate the next generation of leaders. And so Lacey and Danielle are going to provide us the guidance on those and share their wisdom and experiences. And so I guess I'll just kick it off with if each of you could introduce yourselves, provide a little bit of background and maybe the path that led you to leadership roles. Don't fight for the mic. Lacey, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll go. Thank you. I was trying to defer to Danielle. So I'm Lacey DeSherry. I am a person in long-term recovery and from co-occurring disorders, including PTSD, depression, and alcohol. And I have been an advocate since I was 18. I started doing public speaking and advocacy work as a consultant through the foster care system. And through that journey, I had the fortune to become the first full-time consultant, lived experience consultant at the National Resource Center for Youth Development. And we were part of several technical assistance centers through the Children's Bureau, where we traveled around to different states to help youth voice in the foster care system. And through my own journey of recognizing unmet mental health needs and suicidal ideation, I came to realize that and get connected with this whole other youth movement that was happening in the mental health field. And then, fast forward 8 years later, same story, got really involved in advocacy, became the first executive director of Youth Move National, and then came into contact with these amazing, wonderful people in recovery who were doing the same thing over on the substance use recovery side, which eventually led to the founding of Young People in Recovery, and which I'll let Danielle talk about. And I am currently pursuing my PhD in leadership and human resource development. I really look at lived experience leadership and how we gain leadership skills through overcoming adversity. And currently, I'm starting a new job tomorrow at a hospital here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as the lead for their leadership development efforts. So a little bit about me.
Danielle?
Thanks, and thank you, Lacey. It's good to see everyone. Hello, my name is Danielle Torino, and I'm currently the president and CEO of Young People in Recovery. I started my career as an advocate at 19 or 20 as a student at the Rutgers Recovery House in New Brunswick, New Jersey. When we were invited to a big government meeting, I'm pretty sure Lacey was there, and they said, please share your lived experiences and tell us all of your secrets. And it was scary and intimidating. And at the time they were really, and I think we're going to talk about this later, not great policies about how to engage people, specifically young people, with lived experience. And that experience with Rutgers led to me taking my first internship and job at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, where I've spent a lion's share of my career working on myriad issues, actually not specifically working in recovery advocacy or even on advocacy portfolios. My background is in bioethics, privacy and security, and health information technology. And then post leaving government, went into the private sector and private sector technology, and now find myself here again at Young People in Recovery. And like Lacey was saying before, we were a part of the original group of young people who were the founders of what I'll call lowercase Young People in Recovery. And over the years, Young People in Recovery was able to establish itself as its own 501c3. We've been around for some years, and we have chapters across 16 states and the District of Columbia, 60 chapters, and we touch about 40,000 lives per year through our services. And I'm really excited today to talk about mine, Lacey's independent journeys, and I think where we see the field going.
Yeah. So keep your mic open, Daniel. I'm going to start the questions with you. Both of you have really described some heavy duty issues that you've dealt with in your careers, and what prepared you, they're kind of a twofold question here. What prepared you for addressing the weight of those issues while also being leaders within your arenas? Because it's kind of a heavy lift of one to address the weight of the issues, but then to be leaders in the field as well.
So I'm going to just say straight up that I don't think I was prepared as a young person aptly for the types of issues that we were going to be talking about publicly, which is why my career eventually developed into such sort of a professional obsession with privacy, confidentiality, informed consent, and policies that engage people, specifically people of lived experience who are talking about very traumatic events and sensitive issues that the rest of the American public wasn't genuinely or generally well informed on really until the last 5 years. And that what I'll call our cadre, our generation where Lacey and I come from, we're sort of just thrown into this mix. And I think the protection that I felt in my own leadership and in my development was the adults in the room, for a lack of a better terminology, mentorship, and a few folks, specifically folks at SAMHSA, who saw what was happening and wanted to make sure that we were establishing safe spaces specifically for young people to come out and not just be given a seat at the table, but be given a platform to talk about these issues, whom without I would not be sitting here today. And is because of those mentors at SAMHSA and the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment that I think I was able to keep the wheels on while exploring and experimenting in this world of being a leader by lived experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it sounds like the guardrails developed as you became more familiar to people who recognize talent, and mentorship seemed to be a crucial part of that. And so Lacey, with your experience, how did you actually kind of evolve into the leader you are today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would say similar to Danielle, our generation of advocates, at least from my perspective on the child welfare side, we had this generation before us that was working on, hey, we need to be at the table, we need to be at the table, we need to be at the table. And so when I got there, we were kind of the first seats at the table. And so it was really a learning experience and a wild experiment on both our parts as well as the supportive adult parts. I'm like, how do we do this? What are we doing? We know we're getting some of it wrong. What are we getting right? How do we help other people get it right? And so in my first role as a lived experience consultant with the National Resource Center, I just had incredible supervisors and directors who somehow understood the need for trauma informed, the need for meeting me where I was as a young person, a young professional. I came into the field, I didn't even know that I was supposed to say good morning to people when I walked into the office, really basic things that that they understood that I wouldn't come in the door with, and they were willing to meet me there and help me develop those along the way. They really took the time to allow me to ask questions, have those deeper conversations, and we traveled a lot. So there was a lot of downtime in between to debrief and, personally and professionally as I learned. And so as we kind of learned along the way, we came up with some best practices on what was helpful for us that we were then able to disseminate out to other people. And one of those that is absolutely essential is strategic sharing. And so that is helping young people, especially at the beginning of their advocacy journey, to understand, why am I sharing my story? What is my purpose for sharing my story? Who is my audience, and what's the key message I need to deliver? So that it's not just this dump of all of the junk that I've been through, right? There's a strategic purpose for what I'm sharing, how I'm sharing it, and then making sure that I'm emotionally safe and that the audience is emotionally safe in what I'm sharing. And so, anybody that starts out their advocacy career, get some strategic sharing. I know YPR has recovery messaging as well on that side of things, but that was one thing that was hugely supportive, as well as just peer connections. I think that was one of the promotive and protective factors along the way, is that in foster care, it was sort of happened as a byproduct of programs that I was involved in, that we just happened to connect with each other on the mental health side, because peer support had been around for so long. There was intentional connection of peers to be able to connect and share and support each other. And so I think creating those spaces for us to be safe with each other was really important as well.
So it sounds like both of you experienced this kind of a similar trajectory, in the sense that a lot of what took place was a product of good contacts. Ultimately you ran into people who looked after you, who took care of you, who guided you along the way. And so there was a great emphasis on the informal side of leadership development, but a lot of people as they like me kind of get toward the end of their careers, they kind of write these letters to the younger selves. And so you all aren't quite there yet, but if you were to write a letter to the you on the upside of the curve, in terms of developing yourselves as leaders, what would be the formal things that you would want to go through? That, you guys went through trial and error, it sounds like, and you survived it, but if you were to do it more, if it was more intentional, what would that look like to you?
I'll jump in and say that what Lacey said about the strategic sharing piece fundamentally was the most important missing element of, there were trainings that we were put through, but I think that there were certainly some regrettable things said in settings that were formal, in settings that were professional, where I was a fellow professional, but also, I don't want to say a token, but I was in some of those situations, absolutely was being tokenized for my youth and my sort of oversharing and my capacity to discuss about issues that were affecting our community. So strategic sharing being part of that, formally developing a policy mind by going back to school and participating in learning about formal government policy, which was just my path, and finding mentors who were policy experts absolutely helped to create what I'll call the synthesis of my lived experience, with where we can actually apply these strategic sharing stories to the elements of our communities and our systems that are broken and absolutely need to be changed. So we're telling not just our own strategic story, but a much larger story about a policy landscape that is generally unjust and unfair to people who are seeking access to treatment for things like substance use disorder and severe mental illness. And then, there were life skills that I hadn't yet had when I was put into these positions, things that were as simple as office dress code or saying good morning, because I went from experiencing an active substance use disorder to the adult world rather quickly. And there were skills and that I was raised to have that were forgotten or were underdeveloped because of where I was at in my own neurological development. And, you know, life skills like balancing a checkbook and hemlines in the office place and things of this nature that might seem really obvious to others were really not that obvious to me. And I needed to have my hand held through what it meant to be a professional, which meant I got sent to a organization where I learned how to speak differently than how I was speaking. That, you know, saying certain things in professional settings versus lived experience sharing settings, that there was a difference between those things. And then I could make the same point using different words and different language, quite literally. And so my training that I received around language and sometimes long lectures from other colleagues about the things that I said were real teachable moments for me. And those are the types of things, especially at Young People in Recovery, life skills that we want to bring to the people that come and share our services with us.
Yeah, but both of you have kind of mentioned the whole notion of you don't just walk into an organization and, you know, kind of assume roles as leaders without at least having the fundamental basis of professionalism. And I've used to hire a lot of folks who were, I guess, under the age of 25, and I remember that they weren't always ready for the workplace. And so part of the job that I had to take on is to say, college, you know, there's no episode of The Jeffersons where the father tells the son, come work for him. He says, Pop, I just graduated from college. Why should I come work for you? And he says, you've shown me that you're educated. Now come show me that you're smart. And so I think there's a huge difference between getting a good education and being ready for the workplace. And that, but you both have seemed to have traversed those. So Lacey, I saw you nodding your head a lot with some of Danielle's comments. Were there any things that resonated with you?
So much, just so much. I think some of it is really, you know, like we talked about, some of those beginning professional skill sets. I think the other thing that there are a few things. You talked about formalized leadership development opportunities, or maybe those wasn't the words that you said, but I think that's one thing that we are super lacking in, just in our fields in general. Corporations have figured out, and industry has figured out, that when they invest in leadership, they can outperform their peers by 13 on key metrics, not twice as much, not times 13. And that's something that we haven't quite figured out how to provide that same level of access to in the social impact sectors, much less for our young leaders. And so that's something that the few opportunities that I did have that were formal leadership opportunities, you know, whether it's mentorship, coaching, or, you know, Georgetown Leadership Academy is there for the mental health side of things. But that's basically, you know, we've got some other ones that have popped up over the last 10 years, but when I was coming up, those were basically our only options. And so really finding those formalized ways that we can approach leadership development and coaching for our young people. But I think a couple of the things that were huge for me that I learned along the way, knowing what my values are and what that looks like in practice would have been super helpful earlier on, so that I could make more informed decisions about whether an opportunity or a job or you know, co-working styles really aligned with my values or didn't. I think I could have avoided some pain, but also, you know, I always grow and learn in that. And then I think self-care too. I think that was one of the biggest challenges in being a lived expert, is bringing up all of the junk and the trauma and reliving that and being exposed over and over again to past trauma. For me, I've had a lot of situations where I was, you know, at the Capitol and doing these large speaking engagements with senators, and would come across a you know, a display of child abuse and neglect, and then I would have a flashback and be in hyperventilating and crying in the bathroom for an hour. And you know, I think some of those things, I didn't know how to really have boundaries or self-care around the things that I needed to address, and how did I stay well outside of that. Because early on, and I've seen this happen a lot with our young advocates, is that, you know, we get some success in doing that and sharing our story, and then we hyper focus on this one aspect of ourselves, and we put everything we have into that part of ourself and giving that part of ourself because we really care and we want to change the system. But then we forget about all these other things that we need to develop. And that includes maintaining boundaries and self-care and wellness. And so I think those are some of the key things that I think would have been helpful for me. And then transferable skill sets, learning like figuring out, okay, yes, I'm a youth advocate, but actually I've picked up a lot of skill sets along the way, like Danielle mentioned, policy, or evaluation or program development or assessment or change management. Those are all things that we pick up that we don't know that we can name and put on a resume and actually transfer to other industries.
Yeah, I think, what both of you all have mentioned is an important point about the fact that you need to have coexisting skills and talents, and that passion is important, but it can't come separated from all the other, whatever the skills are, whether it's policy or, I know, Lacey, you're into organizational development and leadership, but those things have to kind of be coupled like a train, and they have to go down the same track together and not be separated. So talk a little bit about how you all came to that realization yourselves. Well, Lacey, you just did. Daniel, you want to talk about how you came to that realization of what the balancing act is?
Sure. I mean, per our conversation about mentors, I had a mentor who was also my boss at the time, who straight up said to me, Danielle, you're not going to be able to be the young person face and token forever. And what do you actually want to be when you grow up? And what can we do for you here in this government office environment to bring you the skill sets or the training or going back to school, or how can we support you in getting to the place that you want to go? And at the time, as I said, I wasn't in the recovery advocacy movement. I was working on a health information technology team, which at the time was a blossoming business where you couldn't really go to school for some of the things that we were learning on our government projects. And so I feel extraordinarily lucky to have been gotten a front seat view of the development of an entire industry over the course of the time I was at the government, and was offered other trainings and was exposed to people really much smarter than me, who taught me things, who passed on their knowledge to me, and kept me in their pocket. And then that's what led to the policy work around it. And so someone told me that I needed to go out and develop that. And so those mentorship and trust relationships that we're building, and to Lacey's point about transferable skill sets, that communication piece and learning how to go find a mentor is a skill set that we need to be teaching, that we're not always teaching young people, and that you can ask for a mentor at any time. And if you see someone whose pocket you'd like to be in, that there are ways to engage in those conversations. And in the interim, every person in recovery intern or person that I have hired that have come after me, I've had the discussion. I've passed on what I was given of, what do you want to be when you grow up? What sets your soul on fire besides that we want everybody to have equal and fair access? What would you like to actually be doing? Because talking about this for the rest of our lives might not actually be an option.
Yeah. And so someone wrote in the I guess that Lacey just wrote, the Never Eat Alone, the book that has gotten me everywhere I have gotten to this point. But it's a great point that you do need to kind of reach out and seek out help. I think the other thing, the message that I'm taking from what both of you all are saying, is that organizations should not assume that leadership evolves organically. And while people may have the inherent or the aptitude for leadership, that you have to cultivate it as an organization to kind of, parse it out and to find the talent where it exists. And that kind of leads me to one of the other questions, and I think we've talked about this a little bit before. What are the different ways in which leadership actually expresses itself in the organizations that you all have been into? Because not everyone's going to be able to run the shop, nor should everyone run the shop. But that also means that you don't devalue the other forms of leadership that exist. And so what have you all seen as the other ways in which leadership expresses itself in an organization?
Yeah, I'm super excited about this topic, so I'll jump in. So I have been studying leadership and leadership theory at the doctorate level for the last few years. And one thing that I have learned is that traditional, like the older school leadership theory and trait theory, is like you are a leader or you're not. And then it was about positional leadership, like it depends on what position you have and if you have followers, and it limited it kind of to that definition. And the transition that I'm seeing now, and I'm loving, because I really drive with this definition, is that leadership is about how we show up and how we influence other people. And it's not limited to a position. And so it's really about how do we influence those around us. There's everyday leadership. There's how do we show up and espouse the values that we live in or that our organization has for us. And so, I do a lot of work through Dare to Lead. I'm a certified Dare to Lead facilitator with Brene Brown's work. And we talk about this a lot, and particularly digging back into our shame and who we are is how we lead. And those how we show up is indicative of how much of a leader we are. And so I did do some work, though. I want to pop this in here if I can do a shameless plug for some of the work that we did with youth peer support workers. And there's something called the Leadership Architect, which is specific leadership competencies. It's been around for about 40 years. And Korn Ferry, KORNFERRY. They're the biggest, one of the largest leadership development, organizational management firms in the world. And they have something called the Leadership Architect. And so what we did is we did that importance sort, and there were peers and peer supervisors who sorted out 67 competencies and identified there were 15 out of those that came out with the data process on as the most important for youth peer leaders to have. And so I'm putting those in the chat here, but it's they are tangible things. They are things that you can develop intentionally, that are measurable, that are observable, that we can actually assess for ourselves. We can do 360 assessments on what these look like, and we can learn these things. And so you can see the list here, but these are some of the things that we can intentionally develop, whether we have a position of leadership or not.
Yeah, I think what's important about that type of background is that it really expresses the need to point toward those things that have an evidence basis as to what's effective. And often intuition can get us to a certain point, but it does have a limit. And the question is, does the approach that you use actually work? And one of the issues that I run into with organizations is that they are constantly faced down with employees who say, well, I've been here for 20 years and I deserve to become, higher up in the ranking. But the question comes back, is that where your leadership really lies? And I think, Daniel, Lacey, as you started this response, that's what that point was, what you were making about. There's kind of this perpetuated myth in America about what constitutes leadership. And it comes down to influence, as you said. And can you guide, can you direct? And you can lead with passion and get people to follow that. You can also lead with methodological approaches and get people to follow that. But what is actual leadership? It's influence, and the extent to which you can get people walking down the right path. That's influence. And you can have peers who are leaders. And it doesn't matter. So I know, Daniel, if you wanted to chime in on some of that point as well.
I agree 100% with Lacey. The formal leadership training and theories that I've been exposed to that I have felt have helped me the most is this idea of speaking to the leader in everyone. That everyone is a leader in their own right, and that it is your job from a positional leader perspective. It is my job as the president and CEO or the vice president, wherever I sit in an organization, to ensure that I am speaking to that. Because then we also want to get the best out of our people and that they're getting the best out of their job. And I feel that in our field, we see high turnover, we see heavy burnout, we see a lack of transferable skill sets as people move up organizational ladders, because we don't always have the money or the resources to be training people. And we're not thinking to put it in our budgets for the year and ask our boards for those things at the not-for-profit level, because we're always trying to operate, in the Maslow's hierarchy of we're always in the survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
And and what we continue to miss through the years in all of these organizations, that we will remain in survival mode until we start investing in leadership opportunities and formal training. I'm thinking specifically of Lacey's work and also the Communities Project work, which is geared towards people in the recovery advocacy movement, where we're literally going to provide that training to people. And it affects everything from the way that we communicate with each other to how we feel about ourselves, including making the decision about whether or not you're in the right position. And we need to be able to lead people in that direction too, instead of warm bodies and seats. And so that was my thought on
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and I think that really piggybacks well on Lacey's point about leadership is not a linear package. It can go in multiple directions, and so it can be shared as well. And the whole notion of being a servant leader means that you sometimes know when to step out of the way and let someone know something that's more than you know. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room to be the leader. In fact, one of the smartest things that leaders can do is to recognize the talent within the other folks and let them take lead on that. So what do you all see as the continued challenges in terms of leadership development, since we've been focusing a lot on how do we actually develop the next generation of leaders?
There's that funding piece that I brought up before from a really tactical perspective. And then I'm going to let Lacey chime in, is that, there needs to be conversations at board levels and at executive levels about how we are going to actually make the financial investment into ensuring that our designated organizations have access to these tools. Because even as an executive level employees, there's only so much that you can do and teach. And I don't know everything by any stretch of the imagination, and I need to improve myself as well. So it should be investable group activity. I'm gonna let Lacey chime in too.
Yeah, I would second that. And also, we don't have to have $20,000 in the budget to do leadership development. It's great, it's helpful, if we want coaches and that sort of a thing, but there are things that, group coaching isn't always an option, but you can also have, a smaller budget for things like buying books, doing book readings together as a group and having somebody facilitate those, and, doing some of that shared learning. And so that's, there are definitely options, but I think also just naming the transitional process of that youth advocates or that advocates go through, and starting with that, gaining our lived experience and naming it as lived experience and naming it as an asset, and helping people to realize that there's a transitional process and a developmental process as we learn how to use our voice. And then we learn how to speak on behalf of many people who have that shared experience. And then we learn how to apply that lived expertise in a profession, as lived experience as a professional skill set, is lived expertise. And so, and then we learn how to then turn around and help that next generation develop their skill sets as we go along that process. And I think even just naming some of those, and there's a lot of free resources out there as well. It's just sometimes being intentional about saving the time, blocking the time, and providing that skill set. Do we need budgets? And if we really want to get into it, yes, absolutely. That's, having coaches, having groups, being able to access trainings, those are all really important, but we don't have to have it. So I don't want people to walk away thinking, oh, we have to have a budget to do leadership development. There are some things that we can do that can be very intentional, that don't require as many zeros.
How contingent is that on the tone that's set at the top? And may step on a toe or two here, but
What's that phrase? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Peter Drucker's famous term, yeah.
100%. And to Lacey's point, that intentionality, in my experience, absolutely has to come from the top. And I think that we've seen in our field, particularly, a lot of organizations, specifically nonprofits, over the last few years sort of go down in flames, for a variety of reasons. But a lot of the times when you talk to people who worked in those places or were familiar with those stories, our close colleagues, they'll tell you that it started with culture, and that the intentionality investment, I'm going to call it, as Lacey was talking about, in culture coming from the top is really important. And that without that, you see messes in day-to-day operations and an inability to communicate correctly and internal confusion sometimes about policies and procedures. And so there's absolutely a lot of tactical leadership operational skills that need to be valued and recruited by a board or whoever does the hiring or whoever is in charge, who's ever in charge of who's in charge. There needs to be an investment on that level to ensure that that top-down culture is being set.
And so therein lies the what was behind my question, that it seems to be a cascading activity, and that I think both of you have used one word that is that should resonate from our conversation today is intentionality. That, you know, leadership cultivation doesn't come by happenstance. That it is an intentional product. But Lacey, you also mentioned something earlier. I'm going to double back to a couple of questions ago, that you introduced the whole concept of values. And so I think a lot of what Danielle just talked about with respect to being intentional and focused, underlying that also, it seems to be that there's a set of organizational values behind it. And do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So, you know, we all have certain levels of control, and depending on what position we are, it might be wider. And we might not be able to shift an entire culture of an organization, but we can certainly focus on where do I have control, what influence does my team have, and then if you're at the top, certainly something to be more thoughtful about. But when we talk about values, the important thing is not to name the values. The important thing is to go beyond naming the values and identify what are the behaviors that are in line with those values and what are the behaviors that are not in line with those values. And then how do we as a team hold each other accountable for maintaining behaviors which are in line with those values. And so this is part of the work that I do with Dare to Lead and teams, but it is incredible to see when we operationalize and name the values and operationalize, what does that need to look like in our workplace? And what are the ways in which we all agree to hold each other accountable for being in line or out of line with those? And then skilling up, right? We have to skill up to be able to have those hard conversations, to be able to call out when people are not in line with the values, and what are the behaviors that we want to see differently? And can we do our own work so that we're not offloading our own shame and guilt and you know, inability to manage emotion, so that we aren't offloading onto other people? And so we've got to be able to manage our own space in that, as well as how do we name and operationalize these things that seem to be like, you know, kind of out here, but there are ways to make them very observable so that we can all be moving forward together in one motion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a couple of things that you mentioned that hit a couple of important points about leadership qualities. One is self-awareness and the other one is self-regulation. And you actually hit both of those on the money in what you just said, that you need to be self-aware of how what you do influences others, and it also influences yourself in terms of your own personal motivations. But then you have to be able to self-regulate and not use the opportunity. What did someone once tell me recently? I was doing a focus group interview, and the woman said that as you grow into leadership roles, you don't have more rights, you have more responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was just such a lovely statement to make. So let's talk a little bit more about the whole concept of tone setting at the top. But there's also kind of, as I think, Lacey, you started trickling down to the team, there is kind of the notion that people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. And so maybe if you can address that a little bit.
Yes. I think, and this goes back to, and I think this is a very nuanced area that we don't talk enough about in this space. So I'm going to talk about two things. That's an ethical framework from which this entire space needs to be operating from. And we don't really have best practices or observed ethical frameworks as a recovery advocacy community as a whole. We talk about them in pockets, but no one has published anything yet. And I think that this is something that needs to have major league focus on over the next couple of years. And then the second piece of that is going back to what we were talking about before with self-regulation and personal self-care, is that oftentimes in this space, it is my personal experience and observation and professionally, that because we are the helping sort and are deeply connected because of our own lived experience and expertise to the issues at hand, I can conflate my position as XYZ title with my personal recovery program. And that by showing up to work and doing this work, I am somehow acting in service to myself, which to an extent that I am, but that this is what's going to make me better. Not all of the other things that are like necessary at an emotional, spiritual, physiological, and neuroscience level to make me better, right? And I think that this is a problem that I've seen so many times in this field, and like I said, myself have experienced, where those two things aren't the same. That my ability to show up for my job and my work is not the same as self-care. From the perspective of my healing of you is not my healing of me in this professional environment. And that if I'm not really cautious about this, and this goes back to the ethical framework, because I think we need to talk about this, if I'm not cautious about drawing those interpersonal boundaries, in my own personal experience, I'm not a great manager because I'm emotionally reacting to things that are going on around me, because the topical points of what we see every day are extremely emotional. We're still dealing with death, and we're still, we see a lot of difficult things every day in our jobs. So if I'm not emotionally regulated and take it personally when you don't give me a report on time, or you look at me a certain way, or some everyday instance of interpersonal communication happens and I'm on edge, I'm gonna not be so nice.
Yeah, and the question is, how much of that is really about you? If someone has kind of takes a stab at you, and I think the whole notion of self-regulation is that you have to separate it, in your role, you can't take it as a personal attack. And you have to be careful about that. So there's an interesting comment from Todd V. I've been trying to watch the chat a little bit, but he says, I think our challenges are amplified for many of us by having to grow an organization while at the same time develop as a recovery advocate and influencer. So you both have had to do this. So how large a challenge is that for you? Because it's you wear these kind of a multitude of hats all at once.
All the time. So I became the CEO of Youth Move National at 26, I think. And I knew that I had it in me to be a leader in an advocacy movement. What I didn't know is that, oh, by the way, I also have to have all of the skill sets of being a CEO. Plus, I have to have all of the skill sets of being an influencer, plus all the skill sets of dealing with politics, which I did not have as a skill set at that time. I was very collaborative minded and wanted everybody to get along and unite. And, not everybody was interested in that. And I had to learn how to sort through that. And I mean, it's asking us to fill many, many, many different roles all at the same time, all of which have different skill sets. And so we are essentially filling 3 or 4 jobs at once. And so I totally hear you, Todd. It is a challenge. The thing that I found that was the most helpful thing is that we started an informal young people CEO group. I think there were like 4 of us at the time in the US that I could find. And I looked. And so we really just started this, how can we help support each other in this process and know which hats to put on at which times and what skill sets am I missing and how do we work together to kind of help each other to develop those things, even things like time management and dealing with boards and that sort of a thing. So I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Well, but I mean, you ended with a couple of examples that are really important that people need to take into account. That, well, your whole response was that there's a complement of attributes that a leader has to have beyond the expertise of being able to do whatever that specific job is. And it includes a lot of those things like time management, being able to self-regulate and having self-awareness and self-care, a lot of selves. But also being able to coach, to mentor, to guide, And then you have to have the hard kind of business organizational skills of being able to manage budgets, to manage human resources, to coordinate with boards if you're in a nonprofit, and to basically support the board's development as well. So it's a really big job, and so people need to kind of, I think, going back to the questions that we had about what do you do to develop people. Well, one of the things I think it was helpful, Lacey, to have that list of attributes that you provided earlier, because it basically says you can have a lot of the technical expertise, and you certainly not only need, but you must have the passion that comes with the work to do this. But you also need to round it out with a bunch of these other activities. So Danielle, did you have anything to add?
I did. I think it's a really great question, and it's a dichotomy that many of us have had to balance. And personally and professionally, I've seen that influencer, named face advocate routine go really badly for a lot of people. And it can be extremely dangerous to one's personal recovery and family if we're not talking about what we started this conversation with, about strategic messaging and self-care and boundaries. And that trying to fuse those two things is an extraordinarily stressful job. And the type of, I believe in the art of delegation. And so where you can delegate those responsibilities to others, we must, not just to bring up people to come behind us and be our successors, and learn our skills, but also because that's what's necessary, but also because one person can't do all of that at the same time and keep their sanity, and also in my experience. And so who are my fellow leaders in my space and my organization or outside of it who have that influence and that advocacy heart and spirit that I can pass my good ideas to? This is what I do because I prefer to be behind the scenes, which is a personal conclusion that I've come to after years of not being behind the scenes, that I'm healthier back here. So who are my influencer friends that I can be having the conversations with to give the ideas to, or to say, there's this policy thing I don't want to go after, will you help me? Because this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that we need to rely on each other. And to Lacey's point, I have multiple text chains with fellow young EDs in this space where sometimes we just complain to each other. and that helps, and we mentor each other through tough things, and we ask each other for advice, and sometimes we just, the crying in the bathroom stall version that we can now do in the pandemic is crying through a text message. And we do that with each other because I'm only as strong and as smart as the people that I surround myself with.
I think that's an absolutely essential point, that you surround yourself with a community. And that is really important. Because one of the things that I've been noticing, particularly with startup organizations, is your response about delegation is one of the things that they have difficulty doing, and it's sharing. And so I'm going to throw a question. This will be the last question to you, Lacey, to put you on the spot. As a former founding ED of an organization, there are particular concerns that pop up with that in the letting go part, because it's your baby. So talk about, how do you actually let it go? And it may be part of what you just put in your response in the chat.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So one is that how much of my identity is wrapped up in this work. And I think the more percentage of my identity that is focused in on this work, the harder it is to let it go and let it be what it needs to be, past the founding of it. And so for me, I'm very much a startup expert, and I'm not the long-term maintenance person. And so I've learned that about myself over the years. And so me personally, it's easier now to let go of that, knowing that I love the startup phase. I don't need to be in control of it after it gets going. The ego comment, though, is especially around delegation and recovery helps me a lot with this, and checking that with humility. But I don't need to be the end all be all of all of the things. I used to think, well, I have to do everything. And I used to think that I can't ask for help because people will see me as less than, or believe that I can't do my job, or more than that, that people will think that youth can't do this work and that the entire youth movement would fall. And some of that was fear, and some of it was real. I had that feedback, and well, if you see, you guys can't do it, so nobody else can do it. And I did have that very real pressure. But for me, it was my ego that like, well, I have to make sure that this happens because the whole youth movement is watching, you know, me and my team be the first ones out there to do this, at least in the mental health space. And I think some of that was, you know, fear driven, and that, you know, it's not all contingent on me, and it's not all. And even though I was the representative at the time, it really was. And I am proud that I was able to really sort of focus on that collaborative piece, and bring multiple organizations together, because then it didn't depend all on one organization, right? And so
And it's a win-win because you take load off of your shoulders, which frees you up to do what you need to do.
exactly.
But it also allows other talents to cultivate within the group, and other leadership talents in particular to emerge. And so you get to share and spread. And I think one of the points that you and Daniel both have brought out about kind of an organizational cultures, it's pretty clear that from a lot of engagement surveys that are done throughout the country, that to the extent that people feel as though they're valued contributors to an organization, they will more likely not just, you know, buy into it, but they will own it. And that's what you want, is engaged employees. Okay, so we're at the end. And I just want to check with Vanessa or Lee to see if you all have been tracking anything in questions or the chat that we may not have gotten to real quick.
Yeah, I can share that we had a question about whether this recording would be shared, and I figured we could take care of that after you guys finish up any last thoughts that you have, but I just wanted to flag that.
Okay, all right, and it will be shared. So any last thoughts, Lacey, Danielle?
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk about these things. They're really important, and that, you know, we can be visionary and we can be strategic and we can be tactical all in the same person, but it's a lot easier when you have help and invite in, you know, call in the cavalry for backup.
Yeah, and I think just giving ourselves permission to not have to be all things to all people. And as you know, we talked about a lot, is really surrounding ourselves with people who are smarter than I am in a lot of different areas. And I think when we unite, our voices are way more powerful than if we work separately. And so just encourage everybody to think about, where can I be more collaborative, and what can I build other people up to be able to do and be part of.
Great, thanks. So before we close, I just wanted to point out a series of other upcoming events that folks might be interested in here. And so, and you can go ahead to the next slide, Vanessa. And just, you know, in case folks want to learn more about what C4 does as a whole in terms of training and technical assistance, you can reach out to us. You can also learn more about the Power and get access to the Power Hour recordings by accessing the website and the upcoming events as well. So again, I want to thank Lacey and Danielle. You guys really were great in sharing your wisdom, and your personal stories was most helpful. And thanks, Vanessa and Lee, for your technical support on this. We really couldn't have done this without you, without it, you know, going off without a hitch. And thanks to everybody who participated today. We hope this was helpful, and we hope to see you again. And most importantly, be safe.
Thanks, Larry. Bye, everyone.
Hey, take care, everybody.